Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. I want you to close your eyes and place yourself in the North Atlantic, sometime around the year 900. You are sitting on a narrow wooden bench, your back aching, your hands blistered. The air is not fresh. It is heavy with salt spray, the smell of wet wool, and 50 other unwashed men. You are hungry. In the movies, or perhaps in the romanticized paintings of the 19th century, this is the moment where a rugged warrior reaches into a sack and pulls out a loaf of bread. You can picture it, can't you? A round rustic loaf, perhaps a bit crusty, torn open to reveal a soft, steaming interior. It is a comforting image. It speaks of home, of hearth, of warmth. It is also a complete fabrication. That loaf of bread, the one you are imagining with its airy crumb and golden crust, is a logistical impossibility. It is a ghost. If you were to bring a modern loaf of yeast-risen bread onto a Viking longship, it wouldn't last 3 days. The North Atlantic is a damp, relentless environment. It is a world where moisture is the enemy, and flour is just a sponge waiting to rot. A soft loaf in that humidity would be covered in green fuzz before the ship even lost sight of the coastline. We need to strip away this illusion. We need to deconstruct the very idea of what bread means when you are 1,000 miles from a bakery. The concept of a daily loaf requires an oven. It requires dry storage. It requires a stable environment where dough can rise without being soaked by a rogue wave. A longship has none of these things. There is no oven on board. Lighting a fire big enough to bake bread on a wooden ship covered in tar is essentially a suicide pact. There is no hermetically sealed pantry. There is only the open deck, the rain, and the sea. So, if the bread of the movies is a lie, what fueled the expansion? What gave these men the energy to row for 10, 12 hours a day, burning thousands of calories in the freezing cold? It wasn't grain, at least not in the way we think of it. The bread that built the Viking Age was a preservation miracle, but it looked nothing like food. It was a substance harder than wood, lighter than water, and designed to survive the apocalypse. Tonight, we aren't talking about the feasts of kings in warm fire-lit halls. We are looking at the grim reality of the commute. We are going to look at the caloric mathematics of a raid, the chemistry of rancid fat, and the sheer grinding effort of keeping a human body alive on a diet of dried fish and sour milk. This isn't a recipe video. It is a look at the logistics of survival. To understand why the warm loaf is a myth, you have to look at the flour itself. In a modern kitchen, flour is a stable white powder that sits in a paper bag for months, inert and reliable. But that is because your kitchen is dry. On a longship, the air is not just air. It is a suspension of salt water and mist. Flour is hydrophilic. It loves water. It pulls moisture from the atmosphere with a desperate chemical thirst. In the open hull of a ship, a sack of flour is essentially a dehumidifier that you are planning to eat. Once that moisture gets in, the clock starts ticking. We aren't just talking about a little bit of stale crust. We are talking about biological warfare in your food supply. In the damp anaerobic center of a compressed flour sack, things begin to wake up. You have to remember that this flour isn't the sterile, bleached product you buy today. It is stone ground, full of bran, germ, and wild yeast spores that have been waiting for a drink. The first invader is usually mold, not the polite blue fuzz you might scrape off a piece of cheddar, but a pervasive structural rot. It threads through the grain, creating pockets of heat as it consumes the starch. If you were to stick your hand into a damp sack of flour after 3 days at sea, it would feel warm. That is the heat of decomposition. The food is eating itself before you get a chance to eat it. But mold is manageable compared to the real killer, Bacillus mesentericus. This is the bacteria responsible for a condition bakers call rope. If you have never encountered rope spoilage, consider yourself lucky. It turns the interior of a loaf or a ball of dough into a sticky, stringy, mucus-like substance. When you pull the bread apart, fine, silken threads of slime stretch between the pieces. The smell is distinct. It smells like overripe melons rotting in the sun, mixed with the faint, acidic tang of vomit. This bacteria thrives in damp, warm conditions. A long ship in summer, constantly wet and heated by the bodies of 50 rowing men, is effectively a giant incubator for rope. You might ask, why not just store the flour better? Why not seal it in casks? This brings us to the logistics of weight. A wooden barrel is heavy. It requires a skilled cooper to make it watertight. On a Viking ship, watertight barrels are reserved for the most critical liquid assets: fresh water, sour whey, and perhaps some ale. You do not waste a watertight barrel on dry flour. Flour goes in sacks, linen or wool. These fabrics breathe. They let the sea air in, and they let the sea spray soak through. If the ship takes on water, and it always takes on water, the bilge sloshes around your feet. The sacks are piled on the deckboards, hopefully raised up, but nothing stays dry forever in a storm. Once the salt water hits the flour, it creates a paste. This paste doesn't dry out. The salt holds the moisture there, creating a permanent wet spot that acts as a gateway for every spore in the Atlantic. And then there are the passengers. You are never alone on a ship. Rats and mice are the uninvited crew members. A sack is no barrier to a rat. They chew through the wool in seconds. They eat the grain, but worse, they live in it. They urinate on it. In a dry granary on land, this is a nuisance. In the damp, confined hold of a ship, it accelerates the spoilage. The ammonia from the waste mixes with the rotting gluten, creating a chemical profile that tells your nose, very clearly, to stay away. Imagine the disappointment. You have been rowing for 6 hours. The cold is seeping into your bones. You reach for the sack that was supposed to hold your carbohydrate ration. You untie the sodden knot. Inside, you don't find flour. You find a solid grey block of sprouted grain, woven together by mold filaments and smelling of sweet decay. It isn't just inedible, it is poison. If you eat it, you risk dysentery, or in the case of rye, ergotism, a fungal poisoning that causes hallucinations and gangrene. Grain, in its raw form, is a land food. It belongs in a dry barn or a stone oven. It does not belong on the open ocean. It is too fragile, too needy, and too prone to failure. If you rely on grain to cross the North Sea, you die. The caloric math simply doesn't work if half your fuel rots before you can burn it. To survive the crossing, the Vikings had to abandon the bakery entirely. They needed a fuel source that was dead, dry, and indestructible. They needed something that moisture couldn't kill because it was already mummified. If grain kills you or rots before you can eat it, we are left with a more pressing problem: the engine. And on a long ship, the engine is you. To understand the diet, you have to understand the sheer, brutal output required to move a ship made of oak through a sea made of resistance. This isn't a leisure cruise. It isn't a kayak trip across a glass calm lake. This is industrial scale labor performed in a freezing wet environment. Consider the oar. It is a 16-foot shaft of solid ash or pine. It is heavy, unbalanced, and cumbersome. Your job is to leverage this piece of timber against the entire weight of the Atlantic Ocean. You reach forward, catch the water, and pull with your legs, your back, and your arms. Then you do it again and again. A steady rowing pace might be 20 strokes a minute. That is 1,200 repetitions an hour. On a standard crossing, or when the wind dies during a raid, you might be at the bench for 10, perhaps 12 hours. That is nearly 15,000 reps of a weighted row, performed while sitting on a hard wooden chest, soaking wet with the temperature hovering just above freezing. This level of exertion creates a caloric deficit that is almost difficult to comprehend for a modern human. A modern office worker might burn 2,000 calories a day. An elite cyclist in the Tour de France might burn 6,000 or 7,000. A Viking oarsman, battling the friction of the water and the thermal drain of the cold wind, is operating at the absolute limit of human endurance. The body becomes a furnace. It screams for fuel. If you stop feeding it, the furnace doesn't just go out. It starts burning the walls. Your body will cannibalize its own muscle tissue for energy within days. This brings us to the failure of grain. Let's look at the math. Carbohydrates, wheat, barley, rye, provide 4 calories per gram. That sounds fine until you look at the volume. To get 6,000 calories from boiled grain or simple bread, you would need to consume a mountain of food. You would need to eat nearly 3 kilograms of bread every single day. Imagine the logistics of that. You are in a ship with 60 other men. If every man needs 3 kilograms of bread a day, and you are at sea for 3 weeks, that is nearly 4 tons of food. 4 tons of space-consuming, moisture-absorbing, rot-prone grain. The ship simply cannot carry it. Every cubic foot of hold space filled with grain is a cubic foot that cannot be used for fresh water, for weapons, or for the loot you hope to bring back. The longship is a masterpiece of efficiency. It has no room for empty volume, but there is also a physiological problem with a carb-heavy diet at sea. Digestion takes energy. If you stuff your stomach with pounds of fibrous grain or heavy porridge, your body diverts blood flow from your muscles to your gut to break it down. You become sluggish. You get cramps. You cannot row at peak efficiency with a belly full of expanding starch. Furthermore, carbohydrates provide a specific type of energy, a spike and a crash. You eat. Your blood sugar soars. You feel energetic for an hour. And then you crash. In the middle of the North Sea, you cannot afford a crash. You cannot afford to be hangry when the rhythm of the stroke depends on absolute synchronization. The Viking engine needed a different fuel source. It needed diesel, not kindling. It needed a fuel that burned slow, hot, and long. It needed density. This is where the nutritional strategy shifts from the agrarian mindset of the farmer to the predatory mindset of the hunter. They needed to maximize the calorie-to-weight ratio. They needed fat and protein. Fat provides 9 calories per gram, more than double the energy of carbohydrates for the same weight. If you base your rations on fat and dense protein, you cut your cargo weight in half. You reduce the volume of food, you free up space in the hull, and you provide a fuel source that digests slowly, releasing a steady stream of energy over 12 hours of rowing without the insulin spikes of bread. The solution to the caloric equation wasn't found in the fields of Denmark. It was found in the cold waters of the north. They needed a substance that was essentially a battery made of meat, something harder than wood, lighter than water, and capable of sitting in a damp hull for months without changing its chemical structure. They needed the true bread of the north. The answer to the riddle, the fuel that allowed a handful of farmers from the edges of the known world to terrorize a continent, is Goddess Morhua, the Atlantic cod, but not the flaky butter-basted fillet you might order at a seaside bistro. To serve its purpose as a logistical engine, the cod had to be transformed. It had to cease being an animal and become a material. It had to become stockfish. If you were to walk onto a Viking ship and pick up a piece of their daily ration, your first instinct would not be to eat it. Your first instinct would be to check if it was a weapon. Stockfish is not merely dried fish. It is mummified protein. It is the result of taking a fresh fish and removing approximately 80% of its water content. When you remove the water, you remove the playground for bacteria. You pause the biological clock of decay. But unlike other preservation methods of the time, The Vikings did not use salt. Salt was a luxury, a trade good, something to be hoarded and sold, not wasted by the ton on daily rations. Instead, they used the only resource they had in infinite supply, the weather. By letting the cold winds strip the moisture from the flesh, they created a substance that was chemically stable. A piece of stockfish can sit in a damp ship's hold for months, or even years, without rotting. It is immune to the mold that destroys flour. It is indifferent to the cold. It is, for all intents and purposes, inert until you decide to wake it up. But the true genius of stockfish lies in its density. When you strip away the water, what remains is a protein concentrate that rivals the most advanced whey powders in a modern bodybuilder's pantry. Stockfish is nearly 80% protein by weight. It is a nutritional bomb. Consider the logistics of the cargo hold again. If you carry fresh fish, or even wet salted fish, you are carrying mostly water. You are burning energy to transport water that you cannot drink and do not need. But with stockfish, you have jettisoned the dead weight. 1 kilogram of stockfish contains the same nutritional value as 5 kilograms of fresh cod. This is a 5-to-1 logistical advantage. It means a ship can carry 5 times the food range in the same amount of space, or it can carry the same range with a lighter, faster ship. This efficiency changed the map of the world. It allowed Vikings to bypass the coast-hugging limitations of their enemies. A Frankish or English ship needed to stop frequently to resupply. Tethered to the shore by the spoilage rates of their grain and heavy salted meats, a Viking ship loaded with stacks of dried cod, literally stacked like firewood, hence the name stock or stickfish, could vanish into the open ocean for weeks. They could strike from the sea because their food supply didn't rot, didn't weigh them down, and didn't require cooking. And it was specific to cod. You cannot do this with just any fish. You cannot stock dry a salmon or a herring in the same way. Those fish are oily. If you hang a fatty fish in the wind, the fat oxidizes. It turns rancid, tasting of old paint and spoiled milk. But the cod is unique. The cod stores its fat in its liver, leaving the flesh lean, white, and pristine. When it dries, it doesn't spoil. It petrifies. It becomes a pure golden ingot of survival, waiting for the jaw strong enough to reclaim it. To understand the scale of this operation, you have to leave the ship for a moment and stand on the coast of northern Norway in late winter. It is February. The sun is barely dragging itself above the horizon. The wind is cutting through your tunic like a knife, and everywhere you look, the landscape is dominated by skeletons. Not human skeletons, but vast wooden cathedrals rising up from the rocky shoreline. These are the yell, the drying racks. They look like unfinished buildings, great lattices of timber scaffolding that stretch for acres. And hanging from them, dripping in the cold wind, are thousands upon thousands of Atlantic cod. This wasn't a cottage industry where a fisherman dried a few fillets for his family. This was industrial food production on a scale that rivals modern factory farming. The Vikings understood that to launch a fleet, you first had to build the battery factory. The process begins with the skrei, the wandering cod that migrate from the Barents Sea to the Norwegian coast to spawn. The timing is non-negotiable. The fish arrive in the dead of winter when the air is coldest. The catch is hauled in, and the processing happens immediately on the shore. There is no delicacy here. The fish are gutted and their heads are removed. A brutal, efficient decapitation. The heads aren't wasted. They are dried separately for protein or ground up. But the prize is the body. The bodies are tied together in pairs by the tail, usually with a simple knot of natural fiber, or even by using the fish's own skin. Then they are slung over the wooden rails of the yell. There they hang, skin side out, like a bizarre fruit ripening in the Arctic twilight. But why here? Why this specific stretch of frozen coast? This is where the genius of Viking logistics meets the luck of geography. Making stockfish requires a Goldilocks climate that is almost impossible to find anywhere else. The temperature must be cold, just above freezing. If it gets too warm, above roughly 7 degrees Celsius, the fish will attract flies. Maggots will hatch in the flesh, and the bacteria will bloom, turning the catch into a rotting biohazard. However, it cannot be too cold. If the temperature drops well below freezing, the water inside the fish cells turns to ice. Ice crystals expand. They act like microscopic daggers, shredding the muscle fibers of the fish. If the fish freezes before it dries, the texture is ruined. The meat turns to a cotton-like mush that falls apart and has no structural integrity. It becomes useless for long-term storage. So, the Vikings relied on the unique microclimate of the Lofoten Islands and the northern coast, where the Gulf Stream pushes warm water up against the Arctic air. It creates a narrow thermal band where it is cold enough to stop rot, but warm enough to prevent freezing. It is preservation by weather. This method solved the greatest economic hurdle of food preservation, the cost of additives. In the rest of Europe, preserving meat meant salt. Salt was expensive. It had to be mined or evaporated from the sea in large pans, which required fuel, wood or coal to boil the water off. Salted fish was a luxury product because the preservative itself cost money, but stockfish required no salt. The wind is free, the cold is free, the sun is free. The only investment was the labor to hang it and the patience to wait. And wait they did. The fish hang there for months, from February until May. In the first few weeks, a specific bacteria does colonize the fish, fermenting it slightly, breaking down the fibers just enough to mature the flavor. But as the wind whistles through the racks, stripping away the moisture, the bacteria run out of water. They go dormant. The process stops. The fish shrinks, hardens, and changes color from white to a dull, woody yellow. The sensory experience of a drying village is something that likely hasn't changed in 1,000 years. If you were to walk through a Viking settlement in April, the air would be thick with it. It isn't the sharp, rotten stench of a garbage dump. It is a heavy, pervasive, savory aroma. It smells of the sea, of concentrated umami, and of old leather. To a modern nose, it might be overwhelming, a smell that clings to your hair and clothes for days. But to a Viking, that smell didn't signal disgust. It signaled safety. It was the olfactory proof that the winter wouldn't kill them, and that when the ice melted, the ships would be full. By the time late spring arrives, the fish are harvested. They are no longer flesh. They are rigid planks of protein. They find that they have lost 80% of their weight, but retained almost all of their nutrients. They can be stacked like firewood in the back of a barn or the hull of a ship. They don't need barrels. They don't need salt to keep the bugs away. They are armor-plated against decay. But now that you have this indestructible brick of food, you face the next logistical hurdle. How exactly are you supposed to eat it? So, you have retrieved your ration from the stack. You are holding a piece of stockfish in your hand. And this is where the reality of the Viking diet crashes into the modern expectation of what food is supposed to be. To the uninitiated, a piece of fully dried stockfish does not register as something edible. It feels like a piece of driftwood. It feels like a shingle you might tear off a roof after a hurricane. It has a grain, like timber. It has a hardness that feels geological rather than biological. If you were to strike a fellow crew member with a whole dried cod, you wouldn't just insult them. You would give them a concussion. Your first instinct might be to take a bite. Do not do this. If you attempt to bite into a piece of unprocessed stockfish, you will not break the fish. You will break your teeth. The dehydration process has glued the muscle fibers together with a strength that rivals epoxy. The fish has become a composite material, reinforced by its own dried collagen, It is impervious to the human jaw in its dormant state. Before you can eat it, you have to defeat it. This necessitates a culinary technique that is rarely seen in modern kitchens: percussive maintenance. You cannot slice stockfish with a knife. The blade would slip, and you'd likely lose a finger. You cannot tear it with your hands. You must beat it. On a longship, or in a temporary raiding camp, the preparation of dinner sounds less like cooking and more like carpentry. You find a flat surface, perhaps the gunwale of the ship, or a large smooth stone on the beach. You take the back of your axe, or a dedicated wooden mallet, and you begin to hammer the fish. You are trying to break the structural integrity of the fibers without pulverizing the meat into dust. It is a specific rhythmic violence. You strike it, turn it, strike it again. As you hammer, the fish begins to change. The rigid golden plank starts to yield. The fibers separate, turning from a solid block into a mass of white, fluffy splinters. It begins to look less like wood and more like a frayed heavy rope. Only now, after you have mechanically pre-chewed the food with a hammer, is it safe to put in your mouth. But the work isn't over. Eating stockfish is an endurance sport. You tear off a strip of the beaten fish, which now resembles a piece of fibrous jerky, and you begin to chew. And you chew. And you chew. The initial sensation is dry. Incredibly dry. It acts like a desiccant in your mouth, sucking up every drop of saliva you can produce. As you work your jaw, the fish begins to rehydrate. It slowly transforms from a splintery wood pulp texture into something recognizable as fish meat. The flavor, surprisingly, is not the assault you might expect. Because the fat was largely in the liver, which was removed, the meat itself doesn't have the rancid oxidized funk of oily fish. It is mild. It tastes of the sea, of salt, and of a concentrated, savory umami that is almost creamy once it finally breaks down. It is pure protein, clean and austere, but it is also relentless. A meal of stockfish takes time. It keeps the mouth busy. It keeps the jaw moving. For a rower sitting in the cold for hours on end, this might have been a small mercy. A distraction, a piece of savory chewing gum that lasted for half an hour. But there is a limit to how much dry protein a human being can consume. It is fibrous, it is tough, and frankly, it is boring. It is a fuel that demands a lubricant. You can survive on stockfish, but you cannot thrive on it alone. The dryness coats your throat. The lack of moisture makes it hard to swallow. Your body, screaming for warmth, needs something to burn that isn't just structural protein. It needs the one thing the fish cannot provide. It needs grease. You are sitting on that bench, your jaw aching from the mechanical effort of chewing rehydrated cod. You have protein. You have the building blocks to repair the muscle fibers you are tearing apart with every pull of the oar. But you have a problem. In the freezing cold of the North Atlantic, protein is an inefficient heat source. In fact, if you were to survive on stockfish alone, you would likely die. There is a phenomenon known to explorers and survivalists called rabbit starvation, or protein poisoning. If your diet consists entirely of lean meat, like rabbit, or in this case, dried cod, your liver becomes overwhelmed. It cannot process the nitrogen waste fast enough. You can eat until your stomach is distended, yet you will waste away, suffering from diarrhea, headache, and an insatiable, maddening hunger. To unlock the energy in the fish, and to keep your internal furnace burning against the spray of the ocean, you need a catalyst. You need fat. And for the Vikings, fat did not come in a bottle of olive oil. It came in a keg. It came as butter. We need to recalibrate your understanding of what butter is. In the modern world, butter is a condiment. It is a thin, yellow scraping on a piece of toast, something we use sparingly because we are worried about our waistlines or our cholesterol. We treat it as a luxury, a flavor enhancer. To a Viking raider, this mindset would be suicidal. Butter was not a garnish. It was a primary food group. It was the main course. It was the dense, high-octane fuel that made the entire equation of the voyage possible. Think of the summer months in Scandinavia. The days are long, the grass is green and lush. The cows are producing milk at a rate that the village cannot possibly consume fresh. You cannot store milk. It spoils in hours. So, you process it. You skim the cream, you churn it, and you separate the fat from the water. In doing so, you are essentially creating a biological battery. You are taking the solar energy of the summer sun, which grew the grass, which fed the cow, and storing it in a dense portable block of yellow fat. This butter was so valuable that it functioned as currency. In the laws of the time, taxes and rents were frequently paid in units of butter. A man's wealth could be measured not just in silver arm rings, but in how many kegs of rendered fat he had stacked in his storehouse. It was liquid gold that had been solidified for survival. But this brings us to the storage problem. How do you keep butter from going bad when you don't have a refrigerator? The answer involves salt, and a lot of it. The butter loaded onto a longship was not the sweet, creamy substance you buy at the supermarket. It was heavy salt butter. The salt content might have been as high as 10 or 15%. It was granular, gritty, and intensely saline. This salt acted as a preservative, drawing out the moisture that bacteria need to survive. However, sometimes salt wasn't enough, or perhaps it was too expensive to use in such quantities. This leads us to one of the most fascinating and slightly disturbing archaeological realities of the era: bog butter. Across Northern Europe, in Ireland, Scotland, and Scandinavia, turf cutters have found wooden vessels filled with butter buried deep in the peat bogs. Some of these kegs weigh 100 pounds. Some have been there for 2,000 years. The peat bog is a miraculous anaerobic environment. It is cold, highly acidic, and devoid of oxygen. It is, effectively, a primitive refrigerator that also tans organic material like leather. When you bury butter in a bog, it changes. It ceases to be a dairy product and becomes something else. It turns into a hard, waxy, greyish yellow substance known as adipocere, or grave wax. It doesn't rot. It just waits. We believe this wasn't just ritualistic. It was a long-term storage strategy. A community could bury its surplus fat in the earth, knowing it would be edible, if somewhat acquired in taste, generations later. On the ship, you likely didn't have bog butter, but you had the fermented salted kegs stored under the deck boards. When it was time to eat, you didn't look for a knife to spread it. You took a chunk of this hard, salty grease, and you ate it like cheese. Or more likely, you took your piece of dry, fibrous stockfish and dipped it directly into the butter keg, coating the splinters in a thick layer of fat. The combination is culinary logic stripped to its barest bones. The fish provides the structure, the butter provides the heat. It is a calorie bomb designed to keep a human engine running at 4,000 calories a day. But as you can imagine, butter stored in a wooden barrel for 3 months at sea does not stay sweet. It begins to change. It begins to evolve. And this brings us to the specific flavor profile that a modern palate would classify as spoiled, but a Viking palate recognized as ripe. To the modern palate, the word rancid is a stop sign. It is a biological alarm bell ringing in the deep reptilian part of your brain, telling you that a food source has been compromised. When you open a container of butter in your refrigerator and catch that faint metallic sour whiff of oxidation, you throw it away. You interpret that smell as danger. But on a Viking longship, your relationship with the chemistry of decomposition would have to be fundamentally different. To a Viking, rancidity wasn't necessarily a sign of failure. It was often a sign of flavor, and more importantly, a sign of safety. We need to understand what is actually happening inside that keg of butter as it sits in the damp hold of a ship for 3 months. The process is primarily hydrolysis and oxidation. The fat molecules are reacting with water and oxygen, breaking down long chains of triglycerides into free fatty acids. One of the primary acids produced in this breakdown is butyric acid. The name itself comes from the Greek word for butter, butyron. But butyric acid has a dual nature that is somewhat unsettling. In low concentrations, it gives high-quality butter its rich, creamy depth. In high concentrations, however, it is the primary chemical component of the smell of human vomit. It is also crucially the chemical that gives Parmesan cheese its distinctive sharp funk. This is where cultural conditioning overrides biology. A modern human smells butyric acid in milk and gags because we have been trained to expect pasteurized neutrality. A modern human smells the same acid in a wedge of expensive aged cheese and salivates because we have been trained to classify it as gourmet. The Viking palate was calibrated entirely differently. They lived in a world without refrigeration, which meant they lived in a world where almost nothing was truly fresh in the way we understand it. Everything was cured, dried, salted, or fermented. Their baseline for what tasted good was shifted heavily toward the sour, the acidic, and the funky. This wasn't just about tolerating bad food. It was about utilizing the chemistry of fermentation as a shield. When you allow butter or dairy to ferment in a controlled way, you are inviting specific bacteria, usually lactobacillus, to the party. These bacteria consume the sugars in the dairy and convert them into lactic acid. As the acid level rises, the pH of the food drops. This is the critical mechanism of survival. Most of the pathogens that will kill you, the bacteria that cause botulism, salmonella, or catastrophic food poisoning, cannot survive in a highly acidic environment. They need a neutral pH to thrive. By allowing their butter to go sour, or by deliberately fermenting it before storage, the Vikings were essentially creating a chemical force field around their calories. A sweet, fresh keg of butter is a breeding ground for rot. A sour, rancid, acidic keg of butter is a hostile wasteland for pathogens. It might smell aggressive, but it is safe. So, imagine the flavor profile of your dinner on the high seas. You have your piece of stockfish, which we have established is mild, fibrous, and incredibly dry. It is a blank canvas of texture. Then, you add the butter. This isn't a smooth, creamy addition. It is a sharp, stinging shock to the tongue. It tastes intensely salty, followed by a wave of cheesy, acidic heat that hits the back of the throat. It has the voltage of a strong blue cheese. This intensity served a culinary purpose. When your diet consists of the same dried fish for 90 days in a row, boredom is a genuine psychological threat. You stop wanting to eat. You lose your appetite, and with it, your strength. The intense, eye-watering flavor of the fermented fat cut through the monotony. It forced you to pay attention. It stimulated saliva flow, which helped break down the dry fibers of the fish. It was a flavor profile born of necessity, where the line between rotten and ripe was drawn not by flavor, but by survival. But this reliance on acid didn't stop at butter. The Vikings understood that if you could harness the souring process, you could preserve more than just fat. You could preserve the milk itself. This brings us to the most iconic and perhaps the most misunderstood dairy product of the Viking Age. A substance that sits somewhere between a cheese and a yogurt, and which became the anchor of their entire nutritional strategy. If butter was the fuel that provided the heat, there was another dairy product that provided the ballast. It is a food that has survived almost unchanged for 1,000 years, clinging to existence on the remote farms of Iceland long after it was forgotten. in the rest of Scandinavia. You might recognize the name from the trendy, expensive cups in your modern dairy aisle. We are talking about Skyer. But before you picture a creamy fruit-sweetened breakfast snack, we need to strip away the modern marketing. The Skyer of the Viking Age was not a yogurt. In fact, legally and chemically, Skyer isn't a yogurt at all. It is a cheese. It is a soft, fresh, acid-cured cheese, closer in DNA to a German quark or a Middle Eastern labna than to the sugary cups you buy today. And on a long ship, it wasn't a health food choice. It was a desperate attempt to salvage the one part of the milk that butter left behind. Think back to the butter production we just discussed. To make butter, you skim the cream, the fat, off the top of the milk. This leaves you with a massive volume of skimmed milk. In a pre-industrial world, you cannot afford to throw this away. It is full of protein, calcium, and water. But skimmed milk is fragile. Without the fat to protect it, and without refrigeration, it will spoil into a foul, bacterial soup within hours. You have to stabilize it. You have to lock it in time. The Viking solution was Skyer. The process begins by taking that skimmed milk and heating it, usually to near boiling, to kill off the wild bacteria that would cause uncontrolled rotting. Then it is cooled down to blood temperature. This is the crucial moment. The maker introduces a culture, a splash of old Skyer from a previous batch. This is an heirloom culture, a living chain of bacteria passed down from batch to batch, year after year, sometimes for generations. This culture is aggressive. It doesn't just sour the milk, it dominates it. But the bacteria needs help. To turn this liquid into a solid that can be transported, the Vikings added rennet. Rennet is an enzyme complex found in the stomachs of unweaned calves. By adding a piece of dried calf stomach to the milk, they triggered coagulation. The milk proteins, the casein, snap together, trapping the liquid whey inside a microscopic net. The milk transforms from a liquid into a solid gel. This gel is then cut and hung in fabric bags to drain. And it drains for hours, sometimes days. The goal is to remove as much moisture as possible. What remains in the bag is a dense white concentrate of casein protein. It is so thick that if you stick a spoon into a bowl of traditional Skyer, the spoon doesn't lean. It stands at attention like a flagpole. If you turn the bowl upside down, gravity simply gives up. The Skyer stays put. This density is the logistical key. By removing the whey, you are once again reducing weight and volume. You are left with a food that is essentially pure protein, stabilized by a pH so low that most spoilage organisms simply curl up and die upon contact. A barrel of Skyer is a barrel of acid-preserved muscle fuel. The taste of this historical Skyer would likely be a shock to a modern palate accustomed to sugar. It is intensely tart. It has a dry, chalky mouthfeel that coats the tongue. It is astringent. When you eat it, it sucks the moisture out of your cheeks. But on a diet of grease and dried fish, this tartness was a godsend. It cut through the heavy coating sensation of the rancid butter. It provided a different texture, something smooth and cooling against the splintery roughness of the stockfish. It was usually eaten cold, perhaps mixed with a little milk to thin it out if you were on a farm, but on a ship, it was likely eaten straight, a sour paste scooped out of a wooden keg. It was the anchor of the diet, a reliable, non-perishable source of fresh protein that didn't require killing an animal or catching a fish. It was the safety net. As long as the Skyer barrel wasn't empty, you weren't going to starve. But in making Skyer, the Vikings created a byproduct. When you strain the curds, you are left with a vast amount of yellowish-green liquid dripping out of the bag. In a modern factory, this is often treated as waste. In the Viking Age, this liquid was arguably more valuable than the cheese itself. It was the multi-purpose chemical solvent of the North Atlantic. This brings us to the liquid that was dripping from those linen bags of Skyer. In a modern industrial dairy, this yellowish-green fluid is often treated as a nuisance, a waste product to be disposed of or processed into protein powders for bodybuilders. But to a Viking logistics planner, this liquid was arguably more valuable than the cheese itself. This is mice, or sour whey. And on a longship, the barrel of mice was the closest thing they had to a universal survival tool. You have to understand the economy of resources on a ship. You cannot afford waste. When you separate the curd for Skyer, you are left with a massive volume of liquid. To throw it overboard would be an act of madness. This liquid is water, yes, but it is water that has been biologically fortified. It contains lactose, vitamins, minerals, and most importantly, a potent concentration of lactic acid. It is this acid that transforms the whey from a byproduct into a chemical weapon against starvation. Its primary function was as a preservative, a technique known in the Nordic countries as suring. We have already discussed how expensive salt was. Salt had to be mined or evaporated. It was a trade good, a commodity that cost silver. But whey was free. It was the natural result of making the food you were already going to eat. If you couldn't afford to pack a barrel of pork and salt, you packed it in whey. Imagine a watertight barrel in the hold of the ship. You pry off the lid. Inside, submerged in a cloudy greenish brine, are hunks of meat. Mutton, horse, or pork. They are floating in the sour whey. To a modern eye, it looks like a biological specimen jar, something you might see in a medical museum. But chemically, it is a masterpiece of preservation. The acidity of the whey is high enough that putrefying bacteria cannot gain a foothold. The meat doesn't rot. It doesn't dry out like the stockfish or the salted beef. It stays moist, tender, and safe, suspended in a state of acidic stasis for months. When you pulled a piece of meat from the whey barrel, it didn't taste like fresh roast pork. It had absorbed the character of the liquid. It was sour, tangy, and chemically cooked by the acid, much like a ceviche, but with a deeper, funkier dairy undertone. It was a flavor profile that defined the era. Everything tasted faintly of the farm, even the meat. But the whey wasn't just a marinade, it was the primary hydration strategy. We will talk about the dangers of water in a moment, but you must realize that fresh water in a wooden barrel goes bad. It grows slime. It grows algae. It smells of sulfur and rot after a week. Sour whey, however, is already stable. The fermentation has already happened. It is a dead liquid in the sense that the biological war is over and the acid won. You can store a barrel of whey for a year and it will be just as drinkable and just as safe as the day you sealed it. And they did drink it in vast quantities. Often it was mixed with water and a drink called blunder, a simple dilution that stretched the supply. But on the rowing bench, when the physical exertion was peaking, they likely drank it straight. You have to consider the physiology of rowing. You are sweating profusely. You are losing salt, potassium, and electrolytes. If you drink pure water, you risk flushing out what little salt remains in your system, leading to cramps and weakness. Sour whey is effectively a primitive isotonic sports drink. It is the Gatorade of the North Sea. It is packed with the very electrolytes your body is screaming for. The taste is sharp, a biting, thirst-quenching sourness that cuts through the mucus and dust of the open ocean. It doesn't coat the mouth like water or ale. It strips it clean. It is refreshing in a way that only something highly acidic can be. When the ale ran out, and the ale always ran out, the crew switched to the whey barrel. It was the beverage of endurance. It was the drink of the long haul. It kept the bowels moving. It kept the muscles firing. And it provided a steady drip feed of calories that water simply couldn't match. It was the unsung hero of the voyage, a murky, sour fluid that kept the engine lubricated when everything else was dry and hard. But floating in that way, or packed in the salt barrels next to it, was the heavy fuel, the iron rations reserved for the moments when fish and cheese simply weren't enough. If stockfish was the diesel fuel that kept the engine idling, and sour whey was the coolant that kept it from overheating, then salted meat was the nitrous oxide. It was the heavy, dense, luxury fuel reserved for moments when the human machine needed to operate at maximum output. But do not make the mistake of thinking this was a steak dinner. The salted meat of the Viking Age was a product so chemically altered by its preservation that a modern butcher would likely hesitate to classify it as meat at all. On a longship, space is life. You do not fill the hold with cows or pigs unless you plan to sleep standing up. Livestock takes up room, it eats your grain, and it drinks your water. So, the animals were slaughtered and processed long before the ship ever touched the water. The primary candidate for the barrel was pork. The pig is a caloric miracle. It converts waste food into high-density fat and protein more efficiently than any other European animal. A barrel of salted pork was a barrel of pure energy. But they also packed mutton, sheep being the most common livestock in the north, and frequently horse. We need to pause on the horse meat. To the Christianized populations of Europe that the Vikings were raiding, eating a horse was a taboo, a relic of pagan barbarism. To the Viking, a horse was simply a large, practical animal that tasted good. It was lean, iron-rich, and readily available. When a horse could no longer work, or when a surplus was culled before winter, it went into the barrel just like the pig. This willingness to eat what their enemies would not gave them a logistical edge. They had a wider menu of survival. But how do you keep a slaughtered horse edible if for 3 months at sea? You mummify it. The process of salting meat in the Viking Age was an act of chemical violence. You didn't just sprinkle salt on a pork shoulder, you buried it. The meat was cut into manageable slabs and packed into a barrel with layers of coarse sea salt between every piece. The goal was to create a hypersaline environment where life could not exist. The salt works by osmosis. It aggressively pulls the moisture out of the muscle cells. As the water leaves, the salt enters. It creates a chemical desert within the fibers of the meat. Bacteria, which need water to survive, essentially implode on a cellular level when they touch it. The result is a piece of meat that is microbiologically sterile, but physically transformed. When you pull a piece of salt junk from the barrel after 6 weeks, it is unrecognizable as fresh flesh. It is grey. It is hard. It has shrunk by nearly a third as the water has been drained away. It feels less like food and more like a dense rubber tire. If you were to lick it, it would burn your tongue. This is not seasoning. This is cauterization. To eat this, you have to reverse the process. You cannot simply throw a slab of salted horse onto a fire. It would be inedible, a block of hot salt that would make you vomit from dehydration. You have to soak it. Ideally, you tow it behind the ship in a net, letting the ocean wash it. Though the ocean is salty, it is less salty than the meat. Then you soak it in fresh water, if you have it, or boil it in repeated changes of water to leach the preservative out. This is a problem on a ship where fresh water is ration. As a result, the meat was often eaten still retaining a heavy, briny punch. It was tough, fibrous, and required immense jaw strength to break down. You didn't eat this for the flavor. You ate it for the iron ration effect. The Vikings understood that stockfish and whey, while keeping you alive, did not make you feel powerful. They were light fuels. Salted meat was heavy. It sat in the stomach like a stone, digesting slowly, releasing a steady stream of heavy fats and proteins. It was the food of morale. When the captain opened the meat barrel, it signaled that something significant was about to happen. Perhaps a storm was coming, and the crew needed the extra thermal insulation of animal fat. Or perhaps the coastline was in sight and the rowing pace was about to double for the final assault. It was a tactical nutrient. The psychological effect of chewing on actual animal flesh, even grey, rubbery, salty flesh, triggered a primal satiety that dried fish never could. It reminded the body that it was a predator. It was fuel for violence, stored in a barrel, waiting for the moment when the rowing stopped and the fighting began. But even this heavy ration had a shelf life. Salt can keep the rot away, but it cannot stop the insects. For that, you needed a different element: smoke. If salting was an act of chemical violence, smoking was an exercise in chemical warfare. To understand the next layer of the Viking pantry, you have to step out of the damp, salty air of the ship and into the suffocating darkness of the Eldhus, the firehouse. In a Viking settlement, this wasn't a place you went for warmth. It was a dedicated facility for atmospheric modification. You would smell it long before you saw it. A thick, blue-grey haze would be seeping through the thatch of the roof, carrying the sharp, resinous scent of burning juniper and birch. Inside, the air is unbreathable. The smoke is so thick, it stings your eyes and coats your throat with a layer of soot within seconds. And hanging in the rafters, lost in the gloom like bats in a cave, are the legs of lamb, sides of bacon, and strips of venison. They are hanging there to be transformed. You see, smoke is not just a flavor profile. To the modern palate, smoked implies a delicate hint of hickory on a piece of brisket. To a Viking, smoke was a preservative agent first and a flavoring second. The smoke from a wood fire is a complex cocktail of hundreds of chemical compounds. When that smoke hits the surface of cool, wet meat, it condenses. It wraps the flesh in a microscopic blanket of phenols, acids, and alcohols. The most important of these compounds is formaldehyde. Yes, the same chemical used to preserve specimens in a Victorian laboratory. In the right concentration, formaldehyde is a potent bactericide. It kills the microbes on the surface of the meat instantly. Simultaneously, the phenols act as antioxidants, preventing the fat in the meat from going rancid. While the salt we discussed earlier works from the inside out, drawing water away, the smoke works from the outside in, creating a toxic barrier that no fly or bacteria dares to cross. But there is a physical change as well. The heat and the airflow in the smokehouse dry out the exterior of the meat, forming a hard, leathery skin known as a pellicle. The skin is hydrophobic. It repels water. Think about the environment of the longship again. The constant spray, the mist, the dampness that rots grain in days. A piece of smoked meat is wearing a raincoat. You could hang a smoked leg of lamb from the mast of a ship, exposed to the elements, and the water would simply bead up here and roll off the pellicle. The meat inside stays dry, protected by its own hardened, smoky armor. The choice of wood was critical. They didn't just burn whatever driftwood they found. They preferred hardwoods, specifically birch, and often green juniper branches. Juniper is the signature scent of the Norse kitchen. It produces a dense aromatic smoke that is high in those preserving antimicrobial oils. But it also imparts a flavor that is aggressive, to say the least. When you slice into a piece of Viking smoked meat, you are not getting a subtle culinary experience. The smoke has penetrated deep into the muscle fibers. The taste is intense. It tastes of campfire ash, of pine resin, and of the bitter medicinal tang of the juniper berry. It is a flavor that lingers on the tongue for hours. It is heavy and dark, a taste that feels like it belongs to the winter. This intensity served a practical purpose on the voyage. Much like the rancid butter, the overpowering flavor of the smoked meat helped to mask the other, less pleasant tastes of ship life. If the meat had started to turn slightly before it was smoked, or if it had picked up the taste of the bilge water, the smoke covered it all. It was the great equalizer. A piece of meat smoked over a juniper fire tastes primarily of juniper fire, regardless of what it tasted like before. On the ship, these smoked cuts were the ultimate convenience food. They didn't need to be soaked like the salt junk. They didn't need to be beaten like the stockfish. You could simply take a knife, carve off a sliver of dark red-black meat, and eat it cold. It was chewy. Yes, almost like eating the sole of a leather boot. But it was immediate energy. It was a dense nugget of protein and fat that traveled well, resisted the damp, and provided a comforting, earthy connection to the hearth fires back home. However, there was one ingredient that defied all these preservation methods. It was the most perishable substance in the animal, a liquid that spoils within minutes of the heart stopping. Yet, it was so rich in nutrients that the Vikings refused to waste it. They couldn't smoke it, they couldn't dry it on a rack, and they couldn't pack it in a barrel. To save it, they had to trap it inside a matrix of grain. They had to turn it into a very specific iron-rich form of bread. You are standing in the Eldhus again, but this time, the smell of smoke is overpowered by the smell of copper. A pig has just been slaughtered. In a modern context, the blood is washed away, treated as a biohazard, a waste product to be scrubbed from the concrete floor. To a Viking, spilling blood on the ground was an act of economic negligence. That red liquid isn't waste. It is the most concentrated source of vitamins and minerals available to the human body. It is life in liquid form, but it is also a logistical nightmare. Blood is unstable. The moment it leaves the vein, the clock starts ticking. Within minutes, it begins to coagulate, turning from a fluid into a gelatinous, unusable mass. Within hours, it begins to putrefy. You cannot put blood in a barrel. You cannot salt it like pork. You cannot dry it on a rack like cod. To save it, you have to trap it. You have to bind it in a matrix that stops the clock. This is the origin of pulp bread, blood bread. It begins with a frantic energy. As the animal is bled, someone is there with a bucket, catching every drop. They have to whip it constantly with a bundle of birch twigs to break up the fibrin, preventing it from clotting into a solid lump. While it is still liquid, they pour it into a trough, filled with coarse flour, usually barley or rye. There is no water added. The blood is the liquid. The resulting dough is not the pale, elastic substance you associate with baking. It is dark, heavy, and sticky. It looks like mud. It smells metallic. It is a biological concrete. This dough is then shaped into flat cakes or rings. If they are at a settlement, these might be boiled in the broth of the animal, creating a dense dumpling. But for the voyager, for the raider preparing to leave, they were baked. They were thrown onto hot stones or iron griddles over the fire. As the heat hits the dough, the proteins in the blood seize up. The hemoglobin oxidizes, turning the bread from a deep red to a pitch black. These aren't golden loaves. They are charcoal-colored pucks. They are dense, heavy, and incredibly durable. When you dry these blood cakes, they become almost as hard as the stockfish. They were often baked with a hole in the center so they could be threaded onto a pole and hung in the rafters, where the smoke would further cure them. This was the Viking version of an iron supplement pill, but the size of a dinner plate. Consider the nutritional logic. A diet of dried fish and grain is sufficient for calories, but it is often low in iron. Anemia implies weakness. It implies lethargy. On a ship where you need explosive power, you cannot afford to be pale and weak. Eating pulp brew was a direct infusion of heme-iron. It was a way to keep the blood of the crew rich and oxygenated. It was performance-enhancing food. But let's talk about the sensory experience of eating it. You are out at sea. You take down one of these black rings. It is hard, so you likely have to soak it in your soup, or that sour whey we talked about. As it softens, it doesn't turn into a mushy sponge like white bread. It retains a rubbery, dense chewiness. The taste is unmistakable. It doesn't taste like yeast or wheat. It tastes like a nosebleed. It has that deep copper tang of a penny placed on the tongue. It is savory, rich, and mineral. To a modern palate, it might be repulsive, a reminder of the animal's death with every bite. To a Viking, that metallic tang was the taste of vitality. It was a heavy grounding food that sat in the stomach for hours, slowly releasing its energy. This was likely a departure food. It was the bridge between the fresh slaughter of the autumn and the deep preservation of the winter. It was the way you carried the life force of your livestock with you onto the cold ocean. But blood, for all its potency, is just the binder. It is the liquid glue. To make a cake, to make even the semblance of bread, you need the structural material. You need the grain. And this brings us to the final, and perhaps most disappointing, reality of the Viking pantry. We have stripped away the yeast, the softness, and the warmth. Now we must look at the flour itself, because when a Viking did eat grain at sea, it wasn't in the form of a loaf, it was in the form of a tile. We have arrived at the final component of the ration, the one item that modern history has distorted the most. The bread that fueled the Viking expansion was not a loaf, it was a tile, because baking at sea was a logistical impossibility. The bread had to be designed to survive the voyage before it even left the shore. It had to be chemically stable and physically indestructible. This is the origin of the crisp bread, the knekkebrød or flatbread that is still a staple in Scandinavia today. But do not confuse the Viking version with the delicate airy crackers you might buy in a blue box at the supermarket. The Viking ship biscuit was a dense, unleavened slab of survival. The grains available were primarily barley and rye. Wheat was a luxury crop, difficult to grow in the short, cold summers of the north, and usually reserved for the wealthy or for trading. Barley and rye are hardy, but they are low in gluten. They don't want to rise. They want to sit heavy. The dough was a simple mixture of flour and water, perhaps a pinch of salt if they could spare it, kneaded into a stiff paste. This paste was then rolled out thin, crucially thin. If you made it thick, moisture would get trapped in the center. Moisture is the enemy. Moisture brings the mold. So they rolled it out until it was barely 1/4 of an inch thick. And then they cooked it. Not in an oven, but on a heller, a flat stone or an iron plate placed directly over the fire. It was seared, dried out, and toasted until every drop of water had been driven from the starch matrix. The result was a disc that had more in common with a ceramic coaster than a foodstuff. These flatbreads were often baked with a hole in the center, just like the blood bread, so they could be threaded onto poles and hung in the rafters of the longhouse to dry further in the smoke. By the time they were taken down and stacked in the ship's provision chests, they were rock hard. This hardness was a logistical feature. You could stack thousands of these flatbreads in a chest, and the bottom layer would not be crushed by the weight of the top layer. They were dense, they were durable. You could drop a sack of them on the deck, and while they might crack, they wouldn't crumble into dust. They were the perfect carbohydrate delivery system for a voyage where volume and durability were the only metrics that mattered. But eating them was a challenge. If you have ever tried to eat a dry cracker with a dry mouth, you know the difficulty. Now imagine that cracker is 5 times harder, made of coarse barley, and you have been rowing for 10 hours. You cannot simply bite into a Viking ship biscuit. It would shatter your teeth. It resists the jaw. It is an arid landscape that sucks the moisture right out of your tongue. So, the flatbread was rarely eaten alone. It was almost always a vehicle for liquid. It was broken up and thrown into the stew pot to thicken the broth, dissolving slowly into a grain porridge. Or it was used as a trencher, a primitive edible plate. You would lay the hard disc on your knee, pile your wet reconstituted stockfish and rancid butter on top of it, and let the juices seep down into the grain. You had to wait. You had to let the moisture of the meal soften the bread until it was pliable enough to fold or chew. It was a slow food. It forced you to take your time. And the taste? It was the taste of the grain itself, nutty, earthy, and slightly sour from the rye. It was bland, yes, but against the backdrop of salty meat and fishy fish, that blandness was likely a relief. It was a neutral ground in a war of intense flavors. However, there is a hidden cost to this bread. A cost that wasn't paid in silver or labor, but in the physical bodies of the men who ate it. The flatbread was hard, yes, but the real danger wasn't the hardness. It was what was hidden inside the flour. To get the grain into a form where it could be baked into these tiles, it had to be processed. And in the Viking Age, that processing involved a technology that was as destructive as it was essential. To understand why the Viking smile was often a grimace of pain, we have to look at the daily grind. To understand the true texture of that flatbread, and to understand why eating it was an act of slow, deliberate erosion, you have to look at the technology that produced the flour. In the modern world, flour is a ghost. It is a white, powdery, ethereal substance that arrives in a paper bag, completely divorced from the plant it came from. It is soft. It is uniform. It is pure. In the Viking Age, flour was none of these things. Flour was not a product you bought. It was a product you made, usually on your knees, with sweat dripping from your brow. It was the result of a daily, rhythmic battle between biology and geology. The weapon of choice for this battle was the rotary quern. If you were to walk into a Viking longhouse or look into the cargo hold of a well-supplied ship, you would find these devices. They are deceptively simple. Two heavy circular slabs of stone, usually basalt or granite, stacked one on top of the other. The bottom stone, the bed stone, remains stationary. The top stone, the runner stone, is rotated by a wooden handle. The process sounds simple. You pour grain into the hole in the center. You turn the handle, and flour spills out the sides. But the reality is a grueling endurance exercise. To grind enough flour for a single day's ration of flatbreads took hours of continuous monotony-inducing labor. It was the background noise of the Viking world, the low, scraping rumble of stone against stone that signaled the beginning of the day. But why go to this trouble? Why not just grind a few tons of flour at the start of the season and store it in barrels like the meat? The answer lies in the chemistry of the grain itself. A kernel of rye or barley is a biological vault. It is a seed designed to survive the winter and sprout in the spring. It has a hard outer shell, the bran, that protects the nutrient-rich germ inside from oxygen and moisture. As long as that shell is intact, the grain is stable. You can keep whole grain in a dry chest for years. However, the moment you crush that kernel between two stones, you break the seal. You expose the oils in the germ to the air. Oxygen begins to attack the fats immediately. In the damp, uncontrolled environment of a Viking ship, a barrel of pre-ground flour would not stay fresh. It would oxidize. Within weeks, it would turn rancid, developing a bitter, cardboard-like flavor and losing its nutritional potency. So, the Vikings carried the grain whole. They carried sacks of living food. This meant that the flour used for your flatbread was either ground in a frantic marathon just days before the ship launched, or in some cases, ground on board or at landfall camps during the voyage. It was fresh in the most literal sense of the word. But fresh does not mean refined. The milling technology of the time was effective, but it was not precise. The quern crushed everything. It pulverized the starch, yes, but it also shredded the bran and the germ. The resulting meal was not a fine powder. It was a coarse, gritty mixture that looked more like beach sand than modern baking flour. They did have sieves, usually made of stretched linen or horsehair, to sift out the largest pieces of husk. But these were primitive filters. They caught the big shards of hull that would choke you, but they let everything else through. The flour was dark, speckled with brown and grey, heavy with fibre and oil. It produced a dough that was dense and unwilling to stretch. It had no elasticity. But the coarseness of the grain was not the only thing making the flour rough. There was an ingredient added during the milling process that was never listed in any recipe, yet was present in every single bite. It was an ingredient that you couldn't taste, couldn't smell, and couldn't sift out, because it was the same size and weight as the flour particles themselves. We have to talk about the stones. A rotary quern is a machine that works by friction. You are rubbing two massive pieces of rock against each other, with only a thin layer of grain acting as a lubricant between them. Over time, the stones wear down. They get smoother. They get thinner. The geological mass of the quern is slowly, microscopically, being transferred into the food. Every time the stone turned, it shaved off a fine dusting of rock dust, basalt, granite, or sandstone grit. This wasn't a mistake. It was a physical inevitability of the technology. The flour wasn't just whole grain. It was mineral fortified in the most literal and destructive way possible. The stone dust mixed perfectly with the coarse rye meal. It baked into the flatbreads, invisible to the eye. When you dipped your hard biscuit into the stew and softened it, you weren't washing the grit away. You were just suspending it in the liquid. Eating a Viking flatbread was a tactile experience that went beyond chewiness. There was a crunch that shouldn't have been there, a subtle sandy friction that occurred every time your molars met. You were not just eating carbohydrates, you were eating the millstone itself, one microscopic grain at a time. While your stomach could handle the rye, your enamel could not. When we look at the skeletal remains of the Viking Age, particularly the skulls found in graveyards from York to Birka, the first thing that strikes a modern observer is the geometry of the teeth. In a modern mouth, the molars are jagged, filled with peaks and valleys designed to interlock and grind food. In a Viking mouth, specifically one belonging to an adult who had survived on this diet for 30 or 40 years, the molars are often perfectly flat. They look like tables. The cusps have been entirely erased, planed down until the tooth is nothing more than a smooth, level surface. This process, known as dental attrition, was slow and relentless. Effectively, every mouthful of bread, every bowl of porridge, and every stew thickened with meal was a mouthful of sandpaper. You were not just chewing your food, you were filing your teeth. In your 20s, the enamel, the hardest substance in the human body, would begin to wear thin. By your 30s, the enamel on the chewing surfaces might be gone entirely, exposing the dentin underneath. Dentin is softer, yellower, and far more sensitive. The erosion accelerates. For many, this wear continued until the pulp cavity, the living heart of the tooth where the nerves and blood vessels reside, was breached. In a modern context, this is the moment you rush to an emergency dentist for a root canal. On a longship in the middle of the North Sea, there is no dentist. There is only the pain. The pain of a breached pulp chamber is excruciating. It is a throbbing, blinding agony that radiates through the jaw and into the skull. It makes eating impossible. And here lies the cruel irony of the Viking ration. The food required immense jaw strength and prolonged chewing to be edible. Yet the act of chewing was the very thing causing the torture. A warrior might be strong enough to pull an oar for 12 hours, but if he cannot eat his stockfish because his teeth are screaming, he becomes a liability. He starves in the midst of plenty. The archaeological record shows us the consequences. We see skulls with massive abscesses, holes eaten into the jawbone where the infection from a dead tooth spread into the surrounding tissue. These infections were not just painful, they were lethal. In an era without antibiotics, A dental abscess could easily lead to blood poisoning, swelling that closed the airway, or a systemic infection that stopped the heart. It is a sobering thought that for all the dangers of swords and axes, a significant number of Vikings were likely killed by their own bread. There was no real remedy. If a tooth became unbearable, it had to be removed. But extraction tools were primitive. Perhaps a pair of blacksmith's pliers, or the tip of a knife used to pry the root loose. The trauma of such a procedure, performed on a rolling ship with only alcohol, or perhaps a piece of wood to bite on, is difficult to contemplate. And yet, this was the standard. This was the baseline of existence. When you visualize a Viking crew, do not picture the perfect gleaming smiles of Hollywood actors. Picture men and women with teeth worn down to nubs, their jawlines rigid from the effort of chewing tough, preserved proteins, their mouths a landscape of chronic, low-level pain. The grit from the millstone was the invisible tax paid for the calories that kept them alive. It was a diet that built the muscles of the arm and back, while slowly, methodically destroying the machinery of the mouth. This dental attrition also tells us something about their tolerance. To survive this diet, you had to possess a profound capacity for discomfort. You had to accept that eating was work, and that the body was a tool that would inevitably wear out. The grit was simply part of the texture of life, as unavoidable as the salt spray or the cold. But once the food was ground, mixed, and preserved, the challenge shifted from how to chew it to how to make it palatable enough to swallow. When you are miles from a hearth and your jaw's aching, you have to find a way to cook without a kitchen. We have established that your food is hard. It is a collection of dried, salted, and petrified resources that, in their raw state, would break your teeth and dehydrate your body. To turn these tiles and bricks into a meal, you need an intermediary. You need a solvent. You need heat. But here lies the great logistical paradox of the Viking voyage. You are surrounded by water that you cannot drink, and you are floating on a vessel made of fuel that you cannot burn. A longship is, structurally speaking, a floating basket of kindling. The hull is made of oak or pine, dried by the wind, and seasoned by the sun. The planks are caulked with animal hair and moss, then sealed with pine tar, a substance that is flammable enough to be used as a weapon. The rigging is hemp. The sail is wool treated with horse fat. To light an open fire on the deck of such a vessel is an act of insanity. One spark caught by the North Atlantic wind could turn the entire ship into a funeral pyre in minutes. Yet the crew needed hot food to survive the cold. The solution was a piece of technology that is often absent from the romanticized image of the raid: the portable hearth. This was a sturdy iron-bound box, often lined with clay or filled with a deep bed of sand and shingle. It was a contained environment, a tiny mobile patch of land, where a small fire could be safely coaxed into existence. And suspended above this precarious flame was the heart of the ship, the kettle or cauldron. This was a riveted iron pot, often capable of holding 10 or 15 gallons, swinging from a tripod or a specialized hanger. On a voyage, the kettle was not a tool for culinary expression. It was a chemical reactor. Because fuel was scarce, limited to driftwood snatched from the sea or bundles of firewood carefully stowed in the hold, you could not waste heat. Roasting meat on a spit was out of the question. The heat escapes into the air, and the precious fat drips into the fire and is lost. Frying requires a high, aggressive flame that is too dangerous to manage. Boiling was the only logical choice. The water in the kettle acted as a thermal battery, capturing every calorie of heat from the fire and transferring it directly into the food. It was efficient, it was safe, and crucially, it was the only way to reverse the preservation process we have spent so much time discussing. Into this cauldron went everything. The logic of the meal was additive. You did not cook a dish. You maintained a supply. The shards of rock-hard stockfish were thrown in to rehydrate. The slabs of salted horse or pork were added to release their brine into the water, seasoning the mixture. The dense, unleavened flatbreads were crumbled into the liquid to thicken it. If the crew had foraged coastal greens, seaweeds, or wild onions, those went in too. The result was a grey, bubbling slurry. It wasn't a soup, and it wasn't quite a stew. It was a pottage, a homogenized suspension of protein and starch. The boiling process broke down the collagen in the tough meat and the fibers in the fish, softening them just enough to be swallowed without further damaging the teeth. Crucially, boiling conserved the fat. In a calorie-restricted environment, that layer of grease shimmering on the surface of the cauldron was the most valuable part of the meal. When you boil meat, the fat renders out, but stays in the pot. You drank your calories as much as you ate them. This mess was scooped out into wooden bowls, a hot, salty, oily sludge that warmed the core and provided the immense energy required to row. But there were days, perhaps weeks, when the cauldron stayed cold. If the sea was rough, if the ship was pitching and rolling in a gale, lighting even the sandbox fire was impossible. In those moments, the technology reverted to zero. You ate the stockfish raw. You gnawed on the salted meat until your gums bled. The kettle became just another piece of cold iron banging against the mast, a reminder that on the open ocean, warmth is a luxury, not a right. And when you did eat that hot, salty stew, you faced a new problem. First, you have scraped the last of the pottage from your bowl, consuming the grey, salty sludge that keeps your muscles firing. But now, a new problem arises, one that is immediate and desperate. The salt from the preserved meat, the smoke from the dried fish, and the sheer physical exertion of rowing have left you profoundly dehydrated. Your body is screaming for liquid. You are surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean, a limitless expanse of blue, yet you cannot drink a drop. To consume seawater is to accelerate your own demise, the salt stripping the moisture from your cells and leading to hallucinations and kidney failure. You are floating on a desert. So, you turn to the barrels in the hold, but you aren't looking for water. In the Viking Age, water is not a beverage. It is a biological lottery. Standing water is a breeding ground for the invisible killers of the ancient world: cholera, dysentery, and giardia. If you fill a wooden cask with fresh river water and let it sit in the damp, warming hold of a ship for 2 weeks, it becomes a bacterial soup. To drink it is to risk a sickness that a crew on the open sea cannot afford. The solution to this crisis was beer. But we must strip away the modern context of that word. When you hear beer, you picture a frothy pint at a pub, a recreational intoxicant designed for relaxation. On a longship, beer was not for fun. It was a caloric lubricant and a sanitary necessity. The safety of beer comes from its violent birth. To brew it, you must boil the water. The Vikings did not understand the germ theory. They had no concept of microbes, but they understood cause and effect. They knew that drinking from the stream could kill you, but drinking the liquid that had been boiled with grain kept you alive. The brewing process was a sterilization ritual. Furthermore, the finished product contained alcohol and a lowered pH, creating an environment hostile to pathogens. However, a drunken crew is a useless crew. You cannot navigate the treacherous currents of the North Sea if you are intoxicated. Therefore, the daily ration was small beer. This was the product of the second or third running of the grain, after the strong sugary wort had been drained off to make the potent ale for the jarls and the feasts. The grain was rinsed again with water. This produced a weak, cloudy liquid with an alcohol content of perhaps 1 or 2%. This was small beer. It was enough alcohol to keep the water sterile for a few weeks, but not enough to dehydrate the body or dull the senses. It was thick, unfiltered, and full of suspended grain particles. It was essentially liquid bread. It provided hydration, yes, but it also provided a steady trickle of carbohydrates and vitamins. It was the fuel that kept the rowing rhythm steady without dulling the mind. But consider the logistics of this liquid. Water weighs 8 pounds per gallon. A barrel might hold 30 gallons. That is 240 pounds of shifting, sloshing dead weight. A longship might carry dozens of these barrels. They were the heaviest cargo on board, heavier than the men, heavier than the weapons, and they were fragile. Wood expands and contracts. As the ship twisted in the waves, the staves of the barrels would shift. Leakage was a constant, terrifying reality. To hear the drip, drip, drip of ale in the hold was to hear your lifespan ticking away. And even the beer didn't last forever. We have this image of the Vikings drinking ale all the way to Iceland. The reality was likely far more sour. Beer is a living product. As the ship rocked and the sun beat down on the deck, the beer would continue to ferment. It would turn. The bacteria that produce vinegar, acetobacter, would eventually find their way in. By the third week of the voyage, that refreshing small beer would have transformed. It would become sharp, acidic, and flat. It would taste like drinking cold, weak vinegar, but they drank it anyway, because the alternative was the slime in the water casks. Eventually, the beer runs dry. Or perhaps it turns so sour that it becomes vinegar, burning the throat rather than soothing it. When that moment arrives, the crew is forced to turn to the water casks. And this is where the voyage shifts from a logistical challenge to a biological gamble. You might assume that water is a simple substance, clear, tasteless, and inert. But in the year 900 AD, water is never just water. It is a living zoo. To understand why, look at the container. The Vikings did not have stainless steel tanks or BPA-free plastic jerry cans. They had oak. Wood is an organic material. It breathes, it has pores, and crucially, it rots. When you fill a wooden barrel with river water and seal it, you are creating a stagnant, dark, anaerobic environment. It is the perfect incubator. For the first few days of the voyage, the water is palatable. It tastes of the stream it came from, perhaps with a woody note from the cask. But by day 7, the chemistry begins to change. A slimy green biofilm starts to creep up the inside of the staves. This is algae, fed by the microscopic organic matter in the water, and the sugars leaching out of the wood. The water loses its clarity. It turns cloudy. If you were to dip a ladle into the barrel after 2 weeks, the liquid would likely have a faint, ropey texture, trailing thin strands of mucus as you poured it. Then comes the smell. As the oxygen in the sealed barrel is consumed by the algae, anaerobic bacteria take over. They produce sulfur compounds. When the bung is hammered out of a water cask that has been sitting in the sun for a month, the smell that escapes is not the scent of fresh rain. It is the smell of a stagnant pond, of rotten eggs and decaying vegetation. But you drink it. You drink it because you have no choice. The physical demand of rowing a longship burns through hydration at a rate that's difficult to comprehend. You are surrounded by salt spray that cakes on your lips, trickling into your mouth and increasing your thirst. Your body is sweating out liters of fluid. Your brain screams for water, so you hold your nose, you tip the ladle back, and you swallow the slime. The taste is foul, a mix of swamp water, wet wood, and decay. But the taste is the least of your worries. The real danger is invisible. That barrel is a roulette wheel of pathogens. If the stream where the water was collected was contaminated by livestock runoff upstream, or if a rat had crawled into the empty barrel before it was filled, the water is now a delivery system for dysentery. In the chronicles of the era, this was known as the bloody flux. It is a grim, unglamorous reality of Viking warfare. A warrior might be armored against a sword stroke, but he has no defense against the bacteria in his cup. Dysentery causes violent, uncontrollable purging. It drains the body of fluids faster than you can replace them. On a crowded, open-deck ship with no privacy and limited sanitation, a single contaminated water barrel could debilitate half the rowing crew in 48 hours. A ship of sick men is a dead ship. It cannot outrun a storm. It cannot fight. So, the search for fresh water became a constant, desperate obsession. The eyes of the crew were not just scanning the horizon for land or plunder, but for clouds. Rain was a blessing, but catching it on a longship is harder than it sounds. You cannot simply spread the sail to catch the downpour. The sail is wool, greased with animal fat and tar. The water that runs off it would be undrinkable, tainted with hydrocarbons and rancid grease. Instead, they likely used bowls, shields, or dedicated leather tarps stretched between oars to funnel the rain into kegs. It was a frantic activity. Every squall was an opportunity to dilute the green sludge in the barrels with something pure from the sky. In the northern latitudes, on the routes to Iceland and Greenland, they had another option: sea ice. As seawater freezes, the salt is pushed out of the crystal structure. Old sea ice, multi-year ice, is remarkably fresh. If they passed an iceberg or an ice floe, they could chip off chunks of the blue ice, the dense compressed stuff. Melted in the cauldron, this provided water that was ancient, cold, and perfectly sterile. It was the best water a sailor could hope for, a momentary respite from the warm sulphurous broth waiting in the casks. But these moments of relief were rare. For the most part, the hydration strategy was one of endurance. You drank enough to keep your kidneys functioning, but not enough to feel satisfied. You learned to live with a mouth that felt like it was stuffed with cotton. You learned to ignore the headache that comes from chronic low-level dehydration. And you learned to look at the coastline not just as a place to raid, but as a place where the streams ran clear and the water didn't taste like a coffin. Because of the biological hazards lurking in the water barrels and the nutritional monotony of the provision chest, the Viking voyage was rarely a straight shot across the open ocean. Whenever possible, they hugged the shoreline. The coast was a supermarket. The Vikings recognized the symptoms of the winter weakness: scurvy. They knew the cure lay in the green plants growing in the salty spray of the intertidal zone, specifically Cochlearia officinalis, or scurvy grass. It tastes like horseradish, a sharp, hot, peppery shock to the tongue. This bitterness is the taste of survival, packed with vitamin C. The crew would harvest it by the basketful to break the endless cycle of grey meat. But the ultimate prize, the event that would turn a grim voyage into a festival, was the drift whale. A whale stranded on the beach was a biological goldmine. It represented tons of meat and blubber. They would strip the carcass with axes, roasting the dark, iron-rich meat immediately over driftwood fires. It was a caloric explosion, a sudden influx of tens of thousands of calories that replenished the fat reserves of the entire crew in a single day. The smell of a butchered whale is horrendous, but to a Viking crew, it was the sweetest scent imaginable. It meant that for the next week, the rations in the chest could stay shut. We tend to view the Viking crew through the lens of romantic fiction, a band of brothers sharing every hardship equally. It is a compelling image, and for the most part, a lie. A longship was not a commune. It was a floating feudal estate. While the wooden hull confined everyone to the same physical space, the social distance between the stern and the waist of the ship was vast. If you were a common levy soldier, your chest contained the grey diet we have dissected: stockfish, hard rye tiles, sour whey, and salted mutton. Your calories were calculated for survival and labour, but if you looked to the lifting, the raised deck at the stern where the Jarl stood, the menu was different. Archaeological evidence suggests high-status leaders brought personal supplies. While the crew chewed on coarse rye, the Jarl likely had haveti, wheat. Imagine the sensory torture of gnawing on dried cod while the wind carries the scent of fresh, soft wheat bread from the stern. The liquid divide was even sharper. While the crew nursed sour small beer or stagnant water, the Jarl's cup was often filled with imported wine or high-quality mead. This inequality served a specific purpose. It wasn't just greed, it was politics. Food was the currency of loyalty. A smart Jarl knew that sharing a slice of roast meat with a rower was a powerful bonding ritual, a taste of the wealth that the raid promised. They were eating the food of poverty so that one day they might plunder enough silver to eat the food of kings. But until that day came, they had to row. And to understand just how effective this tiered fuel system was, we have to look outside the Viking world. We have to compare their diet to the men they were sailing to kill. When we look at the Roman legions or the medieval armies of Europe, we see a very different nutritional philosophy. And in that difference lies the secret to why the Vikings were so terrifyingly effective. To truly appreciate the logistical miracle of the Viking pantry, we have to look at the gold standard of military engineering that preceded it, the Roman legion. If you were to strip the armor off a Roman legionary and look at the fuel that powered his conquest of Europe, you would find a man made of wheat. The Roman Empire was, at its core, an empire of grain. It was a civilization built on the backs of men who were essentially carbohydrate engines. Consider the daily life of a Roman soldier on campaign. His primary ration was the frumentum, roughly 2 pounds of whole grain wheat or barley handed to him every single day. Just like the Viking, he carried a hand mill. But unlike the Viking, who relied on preserved proteins that were ready to eat, the Roman soldier's day ended with a mandatory bakery shift. After marching 20 miles in sandals, he had to grind his grain, mix it with water, and bake it into panis militaris, military bread, or boil it into a porridge. To wash this down, he didn't drink the protein-rich whey or the fermented small beer of the north. He drank posca. This was a mixture of water and vinegar, sometimes sweetened with honey or herbs. It was a brilliant beverage for its time. The acidity killed bacteria and masked the taste of bad water. But nutritionally, it was effectively a sports drink. It was hydration and sugar. This diet created a specific metabolic profile. The Roman soldier was a sugar burner. He was fueled by glucose. When you eat a diet that is 70% carbohydrates, your energy comes in spikes. You get a surge of power after the meal, followed by a steady decline as your blood sugar drops. To maintain high activity, you need to eat frequently. You are tethered to the rhythm of the glucose cycle. But the greater tether was logistical. Grain is bulky, it is heavy, and compared to fat, it is calorically inefficient. Carbohydrates provide 4 calories of energy per gram. That is the immutable law of physics that defined Roman strategy. To feed a legion of 5,000 men, you needed a river of grain flowing constantly from the rear. Visualize a Roman army on the march. Behind the disciplined ranks of soldiers stretched a chaotic, vulnerable tail of ox carts, mules, and granary wagons. This supply train was the army's Achilles heel. A Roman general could only march as far as his wagons could travel. He was bound to the road network. He was bound to the harvest season. If the enemy cut the supply line, the legion didn't just get hungry, it stopped functioning. The machine ran out of fuel. Now, look back at the Viking longship. There are no wagons, there is no supply line. There is no rear guard protecting a convoy of bread carts. The Viking ship is a self-contained biological unit. It is an organism that carries its entire energy reserve in its belly. This freedom was purchased with the caloric density of their diet. As we discussed with the butter and the stockfish, the Viking ration was dominated by fat and protein. Fat provides 9 calories per gram, more than double the energy density of the Roman wheat. A Viking warrior could carry a week's worth of calories in a small pouch of dried fish and butter that weighed half as much as the Romans' grain sack. In the limited space of a clinker-built ship, This math is the difference between life and death. If the Vikings had tried to fuel their Atlantic crossings with sacks of barley, the ship would have been so heavy it would have swamped in the first gale. The volume of food required would have displaced the crew. By relying on the dense fuel of fat, they purchased range. They bought themselves time. But there is a physiological advantage here as well, one that modern endurance athletes are just rediscovering. By eating a diet high in fat and low in sugar, the Viking crew was likely in a state of ketosis. They were fat adapted. Instead of burning the quick flash kindling of glucose, their metabolisms were burning the slow, hot coal of ketones. This matters on a long shift at the oars. A sugar burner hits the wall, the bonk, when their glycogen stores run dry. They crash. They get the shakes. They lose mental focus. A fat-adapted rower does not crash. He maintains a steady flat line of energy for hours. He doesn't experience the mood swings of blood sugar crashes. In the freezing, monotonous darkness of the North Atlantic, this metabolic stability was a weapon. It kept the mind sharp and the temper even when the body was exhausted. The Roman diet was designed for the sprint and the march, short bursts of high intensity supported by a massive infrastructure. The Viking diet was designed for the marathon and the siege. It was a diet of independence. It allowed a small group of men to detach themselves from the world, to disappear into the ocean for weeks without support, and to arrive on a foreign shore with their strength intact. The Romans conquered the world by building roads to move their bread. The Vikings terrified the world because they didn't need roads and they didn't need bread. They carried the energy of a slaughterhouse in a wooden chest, and that gave them the freedom to strike anywhere at any time. But while this diet made them superior sailors, it created a stark contrast when they landed. Because the people they were raiding, the peasants of England and Francia, were eating a diet that was even worse than the Romans. They were eating the diet of the defeated. When the longship finally hits the mud of an English estuary or a Frankish riverbank, the logistical miracle of the Viking diet stops being a matter of survival and becomes a weapon of war. To understand the sheer physical disparity of the Viking age, we have to look at the people waiting on the shore. The victims of these raids, the Anglo-Saxon farmers, the Frankish villagers, the monks of Lindisfarne, were living in a completely different nutritional reality. They were trapped in the grain trap of the early medieval agrarian economy. The average medieval peasant lived a life defined by the plough. Their entire existence revolved around the cultivation of wheat, oats, and barley. But unlike the Vikings, who used grain as a supplement to a diet of heavy proteins, the peasant used grain as the absolute foundation of existence. Historical analysis suggests that up to 70 or 80% of a peasant's caloric intake came from cereals. They ate bread in the morning, they ate bread at noon, and in the evening, they sat down to the ubiquitous bowl of pottage. Pottage is often compared to the Viking stew, but chemically, they are worlds apart. A peasant's pottage was a vegetable broth, thickened with oats or stale bread. It might contain cabbage, leeks, onions, and peas. What it rarely contained was meat. In the feudal system, animals were draft power, wool producers, or property of the lord. You didn't slaughter a milk cow unless it was dying. You didn't hunt the deer in the forest because that was poaching, a crime often punishable by blinding or death. The peasant diet was a high carbohydrate, low fat, low protein cycle. It kept you alive, but it did not build you up. Now, contrast this with the man jumping off the boat. The Viking raider came from a pastoral society, not a purely agrarian one. The geography of Scandinavia, rocky, cold, with limited arable land, meant that you couldn't rely solely on farming. You had to rely on animals. You had to rely on the sea. The average Norseman grew up in a culture where dairy farming and fishing were the primary industries. From childhood, a Viking was consuming a diet rich in high-quality animal proteins and saturated fats. They were drinking milk, eating cheese, consuming vast quantities of fish, and eating meat when the herds were culled. This is a diet dense in the essential amino acids required for muscle growth and bone density. It is also rich in calcium and vitamin D, the building blocks of a sturdy skeleton. The biological result of this divergence was visible to the naked eye. Archaeological evidence from the period suggests a significant height differential. The Vikings were, on average, taller than the populations they were raiding, but it wasn't just about height. It was about mass. A diet high in protein during the developmental years leads to broader shoulders, denser bones, and a greater capacity for muscle hypertrophy. Imagine the psychological terror of this encounter. The peasant, likely stunted by periods of childhood malnutrition and worn down by a lifetime of carbohydrate-heavy labor, looks up to see a raiding party. He sees men who are physically larger, faster, and stronger. To the malnourished mind, these didn't just look like foreign soldiers, they looked like a different species. This is where the legends of giants and monsters find their roots. They weren't fighting supernatural beings. They were fighting men who had simply eaten better breakfasts for 20 years. This nutritional inequality was the hidden force multiplier of the Viking Age. The raiders had the metabolic capacity for explosive violence that the defenders simply couldn't match. The peasant was fighting to protect a food source, the grain, that was barely keeping him strong enough to lift a pitchfork. The Viking was fighting with the energy of a diet designed for apex predators. The battle was often decided not by the sharpness of the axe, but by the contents of the pantry. The raiders were the biological aristocrats of the Dark Ages, and when they crashed into the grain-fed populations of Europe, the outcome was written in the very chemistry of their blood. The keel grinds against a shingle, the shield wall forms. The violence is sharp, brutal, and short. But once the monastery is burning, the true nature of the raid reveals itself. You aren't just here for the silver. You are here because your body is in a state of controlled starvation. The landfall marks the violent end of the preservation economy and the beginning of the fresh economy. For weeks, your palate has been trapped in a grey, saline prison. Now, you target the pasture. The slaughter is immediate. There is no salting, no smoking. This meat is for tonight. The psychological impact of eating fresh meat, meat that requires no soaking, no hammering, cannot be overstated. It is a chemical signal to the exhausted brain that you have survived. And then there is the grain. You break into storehouses and find fine, white wheat flour. You mix it with fresh water and bake real bread, soft bread. You bite into a warm cake of wheat flatbread, and your teeth meet no resistance. This behavior is often described as gluttony, but biologically, it is a refueling operation. The Viking body, stripped of its glycogen stores, goes into overdrive. You gorge. You eat until you are physically sick, rapidly rebuilding the adipose tissue that the cold North Sea stripped away. It is a metabolic recoil. You are eating the landscape of your enemy, turning their harvest into your muscle. The feast, however, is a temporary reprieve. It is a spike on the graph of survival, not the new baseline. As the days shorten and the frost begins to settle on the English thatch or the Frankish fields, the raiding season officially ends. The ships are dragged high up onto the river banks, well above the flood line, and covered. The frantic mobility of the summer is replaced by the claustrophobic stasis of the winter camp. This is the most dangerous phase of the Viking expedition. You are no longer moving targets. You are a static army, camped in hostile territory, surrounded by a local population that would very much like to see you starve. Consider the logistics of the great heathen army that wintered in Repton in the late 9th century. We are talking about thousands of men, along with their horses and camp followers, hunkering down in a fortified enclosure for months. The local harvest has been eaten, The cattle have been slaughtered. The easy loot is gone. Now you have to survive the long, dark wait until spring. The fresh economy collapses as quickly as it began, and you are forced to return to the preservation economy. But this time, the barrels are lighter. The cheese is harder. The butter is rancid. As the weeks drag on, the camp enters the nutritional valley of death. The first sign that things are going wrong doesn't appear in the stomach, but in the mind. A heavy lethargy settles over the men. Tempers flare over minor infractions. The darkness seems to penetrate the skin. Then the old wounds begin to ache. A scar on your arm from a sword cut 3 years ago starts to turn red. It begins to itch. Then it opens. This is the return of scurvy, the winter weakness. Without the fresh greens of the coast or the organ meats of the seal, your collagen production shuts down. Your body literally begins to unknit itself. Your gums swell into purple, spongy masses that swallow your teeth. The psychological toll is just as heavy as the physical one. Scurvy brings with it a deep, profound depression. You sit in the longhouse listening to the wind howl, watching your own skin bruise at the slightest touch, waiting for the sun to return. When the preserved food finally runs out, when the last rock-hard fish is chewed and the last drop of sour whey is licked from the wood, the diet shifts to the foods of desperation. This is where the Viking knowledge of the landscape becomes a grim tool of survival. You stop looking for food and start looking for filler. You look to the trees. This is the season of bark bread. Bark bread. This is not a culinary choice. It is a famine strategy. You go out into the frozen forest and strip the bark from pine or birch trees. You aren't after the hard outer crust. You need the phloem, the thin, living layer of cambium between the wood and the bark. It is tedious work. You have to scrape this inner bark off in long, slimy ribbons. It is then toasted over the fire until it is brittle and ground in the quern. The resulting flour is a bitter, astringent powder. It has no gluten. It has almost no calories. It is essentially sawdust. To make it edible, you mix it with whatever scraps of real flour you have left, or perhaps some animal blood, and bake it into a dark, heavy brick. Eating it is a chore. It tastes of resin and wood. It sits in the stomach like a stone, providing a sensation of fullness, but offering almost no energy. It creates a false satiety while you slowly starve to death. This was the absolute flaw of the Viking diet. When the bark ran out, the line between food and inedible matter blurred entirely. Men would look at their leather shoes, their shield covers, anything organic that might contain a trace of protein, and wonder if it could be boiled into a soup. It was a season of chewing on wood and drinking melted snow, praying that the heart would keep beating for one more sunrise. We have moved from the age of wood and iron to the age of refrigeration. Yet the ghosts of these desperate survival strategies still haunt the Scandinavian pantry. You can see the lineage of the Viking ration most clearly in the holiday dishes that terrify tourists and test the loyalty of the younger generations. Consider for a moment the strange afterlife of stockfish. We established that the dried cod was a plank of wood, a calorie battery designed to last for years. But to eat it, you had to beat it and soak it. Somewhere along the line, perhaps by accident or perhaps through the grim alchemy of boredom, someone decided to speed up the process using chemistry. They didn't just soak the fish in water, they soaked it in lye. Lye is a caustic substance derived from wood ash, typically used for making soap or cleaning drains. When you submerge the rock-hard stockfish in this basic solution, the proteins don't just rehydrate, they denature. They break down completely. The fish swells to several times its original size, losing its fibrous structure entirely. It becomes lutefisk. The result is a translucent, trembling mass of gelatin. It has the consistency of firm jelly and a faint, lingering taste of soap. It is a food that requires a specific kind of cultural amnesia to enjoy. Today, it is served at Christmas, drowned in bacon fat and mustard sauce to mask the reality of what you are eating. But stripped of its garnish, it is a chemical echo of the longship. It is the taste of a protein source bullied into submission by wood ash, because the alternative was starving. But if lutefisk is a chemical curiosity, Harkal is a biological dare. In the waters around Iceland and Greenland, the Vikings encountered the Greenland shark. It is a massive prehistoric creature, a slow-moving giant of the deep that represents thousands of pounds of meat. But there is a catch. The Greenland shark has no urinary tract. It processes its waste through its skin. Its flesh is saturated with urea and trimethylamine oxide. If you eat it fresh, it acts as a neurotoxin. It creates a drunkenness that leads to convulsions and death. To the starving Viking, this was a cruel joke. A mountain of meat that kills you if you take a bite. But hunger is a patient engineer. They discovered that if you took this toxic carcass, buried it in a shallow pit, covered it with sand and stones to press the fluids out, and let it rot for months, a miracle occurred. The fermentation process breaks down the urea into ammonia. It smells like a floor cleaner. It smells like a dirty litter box. But it is no longer poisonous. After digging it up, the meat is hung to dry for several more months, developing a brown, crusty rind. When it is finally sliced, it looks like cubes of cheese. The texture is rubbery, resisting the tooth. The flavor is an assault. It hits the back of the throat with the intense stinging vapor of ammonia. It triggers a primal gag reflex, a biological warning screaming that this is spoiled, that this is wrong. And yet you swallow it. Today, Harkal is often treated as a novelty, a test of manhood for tourists in Reykjavik. But we must strip away the modern irony. For the Viking settler in a volcanic wasteland where grain refused to grow, this putrid shark wasn't a fun challenge. It was the difference between life and death. It was a triumph of human stubbornness. They looked at a poisonous apex predator and decided to rot it until it became food. These dishes are preserved in the culture not because they are delicious, but because they are the taste of staying alive. They are culinary monuments to the sheer difficulty of the Viking existence. We eat them now with a smile, but the flavor profile is a direct line to the desperation of the winter camp. To truly understand the reality of the Viking voyage, you have to close your eyes. You have to shut off the visual romanticism of the dragon prow cutting through the mist and engage the most primal, honest sense you possess, your sense of smell. We have talked about the taste of the food, the salt, the grit, the sourness, but flavor is fleeting. Smell is environmental. On a longship, the smell is not something you encounter. It is something you inhabit. It is a physical atmosphere, a thick, invisible fog that you breathe for weeks on end. It is the air of the year 900 AD. If you were transported there today, the first breath would likely knock you unconscious. It is a sensory assault that defines your existence. The atmosphere is a dense physical weight. The base layer is the ship itself, green oak sealed with pine tar, a sharp resinous scent that stings the nostrils. Layered over that is the biological humidity of 60 unwashed men in wet wool, smelling of damp sheep and lanolin. Then comes the cargo, the pervasive dusty funk of dried cod, the sharp tang of butyric acid drifting from the rancid butter, and the sulphurous rot rising from the bilge water sloshing beneath the floorboards. The symphony of odors, tar, sweat, dried fish, vomit, tinged fat, and sewage would be enough to make a modern human wretch instantly. It is an environment where the air itself feels thick enough to chew, but the human brain is a merciful organ. After 3 days, a strange phenomenon occurs. You stop smelling it. The olfactory receptors become saturated, and the brain filters it out. The stench of survival fades into the background, becoming just air. You only notice it when you finally step onto land, and the sudden absence of the smell hits you like a physical blow. You realize, looking back at the dark shape of the ship on the beach, that you have been living inside the belly of a beast. We have spent the last hour dissecting the misery of the Viking pantry, looking at the rock-hard fish and rancid butter with a modern grimace. It is easy to look back at this diet as a primitive failure, a desperate attempt to scrape by on the margins of the habitable world. But if we strip away our modern obsession with palatability and look strictly at the biochemistry, a different picture emerges. The Viking diet was not a mistake. It was a highly tuned metabolic weapon. Consider the fuel source. By relying on fats, the butter, the blubber, the fish oil, rather than carbohydrates, the Viking body entered a state of metabolic efficiency. When you run on grain, your blood sugar is a roller coaster. It spikes, giving you a burst of manic energy, and then it crashes, leaving you in the fog of hypoglycemia. You become irritable, weak, and shaky until the next loaf of bread is broken. This is a liability on a ship where vigilance is the only thing keeping you off the rocks. But when you run on fat, the burn is consistent. It is the difference between a bonfire of simple dry straw and a furnace of dense coal. A Viking rower pulling an oar for 10 hours a day wasn't fighting the bonk of a sugar crash. He was tapping into a dense, slow-burning reservoir of energy that allowed for sustained, rhythmic output. He was, in a very literal sense, a diesel engine in a world of gasoline cars. He was slower to start perhaps, but he could run forever. This metabolic flexibility meant that a Viking force could move faster and longer than an enemy tethered to a bread wagon, simply because their bodies were more efficient machines. Then there is the thermodynamics of digestion. In the freezing damp of the North Atlantic, maintaining core temperature is the primary battle. Hypothermia is a faster killer than starvation. Here, the sheer density of the protein played a critical role. Protein has a high thermic effect. The physical act of digesting it generates heat. Eating a diet that is 30 or 40% dried fish and salted meat turns the stomach into an internal radiator. The Viking eating stockfish was actively heating his blood from the inside out. It was a diet designed for the cold, a calorie-dense insulation against the spray. Furthermore, the high protein intake prevented muscle wasting. In a calorie deficit, the body cannibalizes its own muscle tissue for fuel, eating the biceps to feed the heart. But because the Viking ration was so protein heavy, the body was spared this self-destruction. They arrived at the raid not as withered skeletons, but with their muscle mass intact, ready for the explosive violence of the shield wall. While their enemies were growing weaker on a diet of gruel, the Vikings were maintaining the physical infrastructure required to swing an axe. But perhaps the most critical advantage was invisible. It lay in the chemistry of the brain. The North is a place of darkness. The long winters, the endless grey horizons of the sea tar, and the isolation are a recipe for profound psychological collapse. Seasonal affective disorder is a real threat to the survival of a crew. Yet, the Viking diet was saturated with omega-3 fatty acids. The stockfish, the herring, the seal blubber. These are the most potent antidepressants in nature. We now know that these fatty acids are essential for cognitive function, neural repair, and mood regulation. The Viking mind was being constantly lubricated against the darkness. They were eating sanity. They were consuming the very nutrients required to keep the brain sharp, aggressive, and resilient in an environment that tries to break the human spirit. This wasn't a primitive struggle. It was an optimized system. They didn't know the molecular weight of an amino acid, but through centuries of brutal selection, They found the only fuel mix that allowed a human being to function at absolute peak capacity in a freezer. They were not just surviving the environment, they were metabolically adapted to conquer it. So, we return to the present. We step off the damp, heaving deck of the longship and back into the safety of the modern world. We started this journey with a simple image, a loaf of bread, a warm, soft, comforting staple. But as we've seen, the history of survival is rarely soft, and it is almost never warm. The fuel that allowed the Vikings to redraw the map of Europe wasn't the golden grain of the fields. It was the grey, rock-hard preservation of the sea. It is easy to romanticize the raids, to focus on the gleaming swords and dragon prows, but the true engine of the Viking Age was hidden in the boring, smelly details. It was the chemistry of drying fish until it was essentially a plank of wood. It was the logistical genius of realizing that a barrel of sour whey was worth more than a barrel of wine. It was the ability to eat things that would kill a lesser stomach. The Viking expansion wasn't just a triumph of warfare. It was a triumph of the pantry. They conquered the world because they figured out how to carry winter in a box without dying. Now, look around you. Perhaps you are sitting in a kitchen illuminated by the hum of a refrigerator. Inside, there's likely a loaf of bread. It is soft. It is sliced. It has no grit. It is ready for you whenever you want it, requiring no labor, no fear, and no pain. There is water that doesn't taste of slime. There is butter that doesn't smell of vomit. This is a miracle we ignore. We live in an era where the fear of the empty barrel has been erased, where the starvation season is just a concept in a history book, not a reality waiting outside the door. So, the next time you bite into a piece of toast or drink a glass of cold, clean water, take a moment to appreciate the sheer luxurious boredom of it all. You don't have to hammer your dinner. You don't have to drink the rain from a greasy sail. You just have to eat. The longship has sailed on. The drying racks are empty. The fire in the pit is dead. You are safe, you are warm, and your pantry is full. If this journey into the brutal logistics of survival moved you, hit the like button. Think of it as a small tribute to the men who didn't have that luxury. And if you want to explore more nightmares hidden in history, subscribe. Because next time we're stepping into an even darker kitchen, the starvation strategies of the siege of Jerusalem. Close your eyes. Listen to the cold wind outside, knowing it cannot reach you here. You are the beneficiary of 10,000 years of culinary suffering, resting on a mountain of soft pillows. Sleep well, my friends.